Let's call our meeting to order of the California Board of Accountancy Mobility Stakeholder Group. Let's start with a roll call, starting with Stuart.
Stuart Waldman.
Don Driftmeyer.
Joe Petito.
Jose Campos.
Carrie Ann Farrell-Hines.
Dominic Franzella. I'm here.
Right. Thank you for the reminder. We have a quorum with that. Let's proceed to item 1 under item XB with respect to approval of our prior minutes from the July 20th, 2017 meeting.
Move to approve.
Second.
Got a first from Mr. Driftmeyer, second from Mr. Franzella. Is there any discussion? Any comments from the public? We'll call for the vote.
All right, Jose Campos?
Yes.
Joe Petito?
I abstain. I missed the meeting.
Don Driftmeyer?
Yes.
Dominic Franzella?
Yes.
Carrie Ann Farrell-Hines?
Yes.
And Stuart Waldman?
Yes.
With that, motion carries. Item 2 is a written report only. Would entertain any questions if there are any. Seeing none. Item 3 is discussion and possible action regarding the ongoing role of the Mobility Stakeholder Group under item X 9A3. Ms. Mosagi?
Good morning, Mr. Chair and members. Thank you. The purpose of this agenda item is to allow the MSG the opportunity to discuss its ongoing role pursuant to Business and Professions Code Section 5096.21E and provide a recommendation to the CBA. The primary role of the MSG, as you know, is as taken by the CBA in accordance with this code, is to assist the CBA in determining whether allowing a licensee of a particular state to participate in public accounting in California would violate its CBA's duty to protect the public. As the MSG considers what recommendations to make to the CBA regarding the MSG's ongoing role, it may wish to consider the following priorities. Number 1 is to continue to monitor other states' processes and procedures and whether they remain...
Let me interrupt you for a second. Sorry.
Sure.
Could you bring the microphone just closer just to make sure we got clear sound around the very large room here?
Okay, is this better?
Just go into the mic, yeah.
Number 1 is to continue to monitor other states' processes and procedures and whether they remain substantially equivalent to NASBA's guiding principles of enforcement. Number 2 would be the review of enforcement data and statistics related to the practice privilege program, including disciplinary referrals to and from other states. Number 3, determine a meeting schedule. Number 4, continue publishing an annual report. And number 5, consider possible regulatory or statutory changes necessary to further the consumer protection goals of the CBA related to its practice privilege program. Should the MSG wish to consider the role of the CBA's other advisory committees and whether an amendment is necessary to the MSG statutory authority, staff have included in your attachment excerpts of the Business and Professions codes related to the CBA's Enforcement Advisory Committee, the Peer Review Oversight Committee, and the Qualifications Committee. Staff suggests that the MSG recommend to the CBA that the MSG meet on a semi-annual basis to monitor the CBA's practice privilege program and, if appropriate, direct staff to draft a legislative proposal to amend Business and Professions Code Section 5096.21E, consistent with the MSG's revised rule. The MSG may wish to add other topics in discussing this role, and this concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Okay, appreciate that. And as committee members might recall, we had dialogue at prior meetings about, as our, I think, initial charge of evaluating the implementation and a report to the legislature that is also on the agenda for today, sort of what happens next. And so would entertain any thoughts or ideas with respect to what staff have put forth, as well as any other thoughts you might have.
Question, Mr. Chairman?
Please, just pull the mic in close.
To staff. So just so I understand, if the MSG were to recommend going forward, the staff would recommend that legislation be sought because otherwise the role of the MSG would be very narrow if that legislation was not pursued? So is the purpose of the legislation to expand the current role of the MSG?
Mr. Chair, if I may.
Please.
Correct. And
Mr.
just as an, I'm sorry, just as an example, the legislation that was brought forth earlier this year was something that was not within the scope of the MSG, and therefore they weren't able to discuss it. So it's just to allow a wider range of subjects to be discussed that are related to consumer protection.
Was that your point?
Yeah.
Do we see any avenues of a future, well, let me back up. We have an existing legislative provision that has very specific charges and composition and those kinds of things for this committee. If this were, I mean, I guess there's an initial thought of, is the work related to that legislative provision complete, at some point here, maybe with the finalization of a report to the legislature? Does that complete the original charge of that committee, or is there a view that the provision as it stands, especially if the legislation becomes permanent at some future point, that there is still an ongoing set of responsibilities that the CBA through the MSG would have?
And that,
Please pull the microphone up close.
and that actually is the purpose of this discussion item, is to really explore whether the board believes that there's that ongoing role and appropriateness for maintaining the MSG and then expanding that responsibility in other areas as well.
So maybe as a committee, obviously this will ultimately be a decision for the CBA to undertake. But in terms of providing some thoughts, is there a consensus that there is a need to, at a minimum, maintain a committee going forward that, whether it meets on an ad hoc basis or on some limited frequency, that it would make sense to have some committee that's available to the CBA for future mobility-related matters? Mr. Driftmeyer.
Just a couple of thoughts. Thank you for staff. And anytime staff brings a recommendation to do something in the future, my presumption, as in past history, has been that you've thought this through, and you know that there's a process that you can do. Obviously, we relied on NASPA a lot, if you will, to meet our requirement, to give us information, to do a lot of the legwork, along with the staff, in coming to the conclusions that we're coming with today. So as we go forward, we're not going to, or I don't know, but is there a process of doing this monitoring on a semi-annual basis and utilization of either the staff and or NASPA and or whatever? And I think your other point was, does it need to be done by MSG, or can it be absorbed by another committee, by legislatively so? And I guess that's another little add-on there, is do we have to do it as the MSG committee, or does it find a spot in another standing committee already?
So if I maybe can clarify your point, it sounded like, one, you were potentially adding a point or an item under future scope of work as to the monitoring aspects of enforcement guidelines and practices at other jurisdictions. So that was point one. And then two is it a separate committee like this one, or can it sort of be subsumed under an existing committee? And I don't know if there's any immediate thoughts, Mr. Franzella?
So the related to the second point, I don't really have any the continued oversight. The present provisions are kind of silent on what happens to the MSG if the sunset date's removed. The MSG is still in statute and still has an active role, so there seems to be something that needs to occur with that particular committee, whether or not it's sunsetted out or its roles expanded in some form, or whether or not it's just a new committee, an advisory committee to the board. The reason why I believe it might be relevant and important to continue is in relation to the legislative report. We built it on a couple of elements, one of them being the consumer access to information, the other element being the increased enforcement aspects of the mobility provisions, basically through NASBA's guidelines and the states kind of adopting new enforcement practices. But one of the key factors when I was considering the report was the state level oversight that occurred within California related to the mobility program. And I think it offers a strong argument in support of mobility going forward, that there's a very clear and active role going on with the board that continues to monitor mobility. And I'm not saying forever, but at least beyond the initial sunset of this, the 1405 legislation that put mobility in place. So I believe there's a strong reason to continue to have a state-level oversight that's focused on mobility, because and it also gives it more emphasis. We've done the enforcement review. We've determined the states are substantially equivalent. I believe there's a reasonable expectation that somehow we're going to continue to monitor that going forward, so states don't just have adopted it at the onset and not continue to do that. So I believe there's a state-level oversight that should continue, whether or not the board adopts a mobility committee within its own, like the CPC or EPOC or Ledge Committee. I don't have a preference on. I just want to be able to remark within the paper that there's continued state-level oversight focused on this important topic. So that's my perception.
I'm disinclined to recommend the continuation of another committee, but I think that it is important for us to look at the policies and guidelines that the Mobility Stakeholder Group has now recommended and find a home for those, for that work, and potentially ask for an extension of the time of the MSG's work for a specific period of time while we spend some time thinking about where those different responsibilities would lie. Because I am concerned about a duplication of effort, so if we're talking about issues regarding enforcement, then it seems as though that should go into the committee that is charged with that responsibility. If we're looking at, professional guidelines and standards, it seems as though that responsibility should go into that committee. So to give us, I would support a recommendation for extending the life of the MSG for a specific period of time, but I would limit its responsibilities, or recommend limiting its responsibilities to figuring out where the responsibilities of the MSG would be, more appropriately, designated, and then working as a committee to transition those responsibilities into the other committees.
So the only reaction I have is I don't think we're under any kind of set timeline. I mean, this committee will continue to exist as long as that legislation is out there, and so there's specified charges, so there's no need to necessarily seek extension. Your point is you would favor more of a view of winding down a separate committee and putting the very necessary responsibilities of this committee in other committees that already exist. Okay, that's trying to think through the journey we've been on over the last several years. I guess I can't imagine any one committee having been able to absorb that. But now, as you look at more maintenance, and maybe the circumstances are different.
And I do, being a relatively newer member of, certainly of the committee and also of the board, that's part of my, perspective. That's part of my eyes, that I don't have the benefit of knowing what happened before I was here. Yep. But I, can see ways in which, things could be done a little bit differently now that we've accomplished this goal of putting together this report and doing this work.
So let me just summarize. I think we're, just to maybe bring closure to this item. One, there seems to be consensus that the responsibilities of this committee need to continue somewhere, whether it's separate committee or aligned with an existing committee. Two, I'm gathering that it's going to take some legislative action to modify what exists in legislation now for purposes of this committee and expand what another committee is doing, potentially, or revising the existence of this committee as it stands now, and maybe modifying the responsibilities, the composition, the frequency, those kinds of things that may be in order. general agreement around that. I don't know if we need any kind of motion on this. I think we probably have dialogue here that sort of is airing out recommendations that we would have for staff in terms of how we continue to deliberate this. Is there any other comments on that topic? Any input from the public? Oh, sorry.
I just had a question. So do you envision just weighing in on this issue as the bill goes through the legislature, maybe working on, maybe if you need to make changes at that time, that's what you think you would do to make sure that the scope of the MSG was either modified or the responsibilities were transferred to another committee? Because the current responsibilities are just to evaluate the current mobility article and report on whether they meet the consumer protection goals. So...
And report on that. The monitoring aspects of what other jurisdictions
Yeah.
are doing, you consider to be
I think it
not a
might-
continuing responsibility?
Well-
I guess I read that differently.
I don't know. I mean, it said that the responsibility of the mobility stakeholder group, I believe, is to report on the, I'm sorry, computer malfunction here. Subdivision E, whether the provisions of this article are consistent with the board's duty to protect the public, and whether the provisions of this article satisfy the objectives of stakeholders of the accounting profession, including consumers. So I think monitoring other states' jurisdictions might be a little bit beyond that. Could be considered that.
Yeah, not sure yet, and I don't know that we probably need to deliberate that today. I mean, I think we get the overall, I come back to those two key points, and your point is maybe a third one of what's the timing of this.
Yes.
And I would say we continue to keep a topic. I don't see a large urgency to the topic in the short term, but we need to keep that topic and advise or provide our input into the CBA as appropriate. So, Mr. Pettit.
So maybe a thought, maybe a motion to see if there's consensus around whether we all agree that the responsibilities need to be continued. And then maybe kind of get the sense of, I don't think I feel competent enough to determine whether it should be us or another committee. I think that's more of a broader board decision. So perhaps we kind of punt on that one and kind of kick that up to the full board, but maybe it's worthwhile getting a consensus around the first point.
Do I hear the makings of a motion?
Yes, I'd like to make a motion
Okay.
that get a consensus of the group about whether or not, well, I guess the motion would be that the responsibilities of this group and perhaps expanded responsibilities of this group should continue and the form to be determined at some other, where it's located to be determined at some other point. So really just a consensus about the responsibilities and should be continued.
Okay. I got a first from Mr. Petito with respect to the current responsibilities of the mobility stakeholder group.
I'll second it for the purposes of discussion.
We've got a second, I think. Discussion?
Yeah, so I thought you were going in a different direction because of what Mr. Campos said before, which was to ask of the CBA to also give its recommendations or its perspective on the continued, activity of the MSG.
Well, my view is that I think there are responsibilities that should go forward. I'm not sure, to your point, which I thought was very good, where they should be located. I don't know if they should be continued in this committee or whether it's better off breaking them out. And I don't think I have the board perspective to make that determination. I think someone who's a broader board member does.
So let me ask a question of council. Could we amend the motion to include the request of the full board to have a discussion about its perspective on the continued actions of the...
Any results from this committee go to the board by definition.
No,
so.
I know, I understand, but I'm making a specific ask or, instructing the full board that the goal or the desire of the MSG is to get an opinion from the full board as to the continued operation of the MSG. Some consideration. As I'm talking about it, it sounded like that should be a separate motion because it's kind of detailed. But I mean, the MSG is thinking about what its continued role is,
Yeah.
but I think to your point, the full board should also be thinking about what the, role of the MSG should be and, where its responsibilities should lie.
I think the motion as stated meets that objective
Okay,
already.
all right.
Any other discussion? Input from the public? Call for the vote.
Stuart Waldman,
Aye.
Carrie Ann Farrell Hines.
Yes.
Dominic Franzella,
Yes.
Don Driftmeyer,
Yes.
Joe Petito,
Yes.
and Jose Campos.
Yes. Motion carries. All right, good discussion to be continued. Let's move on to item 4 on the agenda, which is discussion with respect to the draft report to the legislature under item 8.4. Mr. Franzella.
Thank you. So this agenda item is the second iteration of the draft legislative report regarding the mobility provisions. The MSG is being asked again to provide input to the CBA regarding the draft report. As requested by the MSG at its last meeting, staff provided a track change version and a clean version of the report. I believe the first attachment to the memorandum is the track change version, and the second attachment is the clean version. For purposes of this limited walkthrough, I'm going to really focus on just a couple of items. As we went through a very detailed review of the report last meeting, I will highlight only a couple of areas, focusing on Section 5 of the report, which is titled California Mobility Program, Equivalent, Less, or More Public Protection than the Prior Practice Privilege Provisions. And so for purposes of the discussion, I'll limit my walkthrough to the track change version of the report. So Section 5 is beginning on page 29 of the track change version. And at the last meeting, the MSG requested that staff revised 2 of the findings in this area, namely the notification requirements and the term expiration sections. The MSG requested that staff revise these areas to state that the CBA believes these areas represent a net equivalent. So beginning first with the notification requirement on page 30, the narrative for this section does note that the CBA did experience a loss in notifications under the present mobility program. However, the finding now articulates that various other protective measures put in place by the legislature countered the loss of the notification requirement. And the finding for the CBA now notes that it believes the mobility program offers a net equivalent level of consumer protection. As for the term expiration subsection in this area, this can be found beginning, I believe, on the bottom of page 30 and continuing on to page 31. Again, in its initial iteration that the MSG reviewed, the conclusion was that this area did not necessarily lend itself to a finding for comparison purposes. Staff revised the area to note that at their core, both programs, both the original provisions under practice provision and the mobility provisions, are predicated on an individual maintaining an unexpired and active license in their respective state in order to operate under the programs. Any interruption in this practice right in the home state would impact practice rights in California. Therefore, the new conclusion reached by the CBA is offered up as a net equivalent. Moving on to consumer access to information, which is on pages 33 to 35. Staff have included some statistical information. I believe the original report was devoid of any statistical information. This is one of the areas where we found a place to include some statistics, and it deals with web page views for both the CBA's own website related to its mobility and practice privilege pages, as well as information we received from NASBA on CPA Verify. The final item I'd like to note and highlight is a new section added to the report titled Enforcement Statistical Information on the Mobility Program. It's the final section before the conclusion. Staff included relevant information regarding enforcement-related activities from January 1, 2014 through July 31st, 2017. So at this time, I'd like to turn discussion back over to the chair, and I'm happy to answer any members' questions.
Thank you for those highlights. As Mr. Franzella indicated, I mean, we've been through this report multiple times now, and so I think these changes are responsive to all the discussion we've had along the way, certainly giving credit to the statistical information that was that could provide some additional context as to the overall environment that we were in as an MSG. And so, any other discussion or comments at this point? Otherwise, would certainly entertain a motion, at least from the MSG's part, to approve the report. Obviously, subject to still some ongoing changes. One, potentially, with respect to any ongoing role of this committee, which may or may not be defined, by the time we publish the report. And two, certainly any updates to any other, editorial things that might need to happen in the finalization. But I think the key framework is in here, and if the committee's so inclined, I would certainly entertain a motion. And we can certainly delegate any review responsibilities to myself as chair or however you think appropriate as we monitor the finalization of this and ultimately the presentation of it to the Board of Accountancy and its subsequent evaluation of the report before it goes to the legislature. Mr. Driftmeyer.
I just want to, first of all, thank Dominic and the staff for putting this together. If you looked at all the materials that we have received over the last few years and this current one with all the additional information, I do move that we go forward with the process of the report.
I'll second.
And I think what that first for Mr. Driftmeyer and second for Mr. Waldman was along the lines as we described it, approve this version of the report to the legislature, subject to the review of any, final modifications needed, I'll call them non-substantive modifications needed, with review by the chair of the committee. Is that how you would envision this?
Of course.
Very well. Any discussion? Input from the public? Call for the vote.
All right. Carrie Ann Farrell-Hines?
Yes.
Stuart Waldman?
Yes.
Jose Campos?
Yes.
Joe Petito?
Yes.
Don Driftmeyer?
Yes.
And Dominic Franzella?
Yes.
Thank you. With that, motion carries. Item 5 on the agenda is just talking about the design and layout of the final version of this report, of which you got a short glimpse of. Mr. Bone?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The purpose of this item is to provide the MSG an opportunity to offer input on the design and layout of the draft report you just discussed. Staff worked with the Department of Consumer Affairs to develop the proposed design of the report, which is provided in the attachment. That version of the report is only based on the first 10 pages of the draft content, but hopefully is sufficient to illustrate how this design report would look. I would like to point out that the title indicated on the design report is just a placeholder. Mr. Chairman, that concludes my remarks, and I'll turn it back to you.
Any input from the committee for Mr. Bone on the proposed formatting?
Looks great.
Yeah, absolutely. Really
Looks
great.
awesome.
Thank you.
All right. We may proceed then.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. Item 6 is discussion and possible action regarding the 2017 MSG annual report. Again, Mr. Bone.
Thank you again, Mr. Chairman. The purpose of this item is to provide the members an opportunity to discuss and possibly approve the 2017 MSG annual report. You may notice that at the July MSG meeting, staff referred to that report as the final report, but given that the MSG may continue to operate beyond 2017, staff felt it prudent to retitle it the 2017 annual report. Since the July MSG meeting, staff made some minor edits that are indicated in the paper, which include updating the chair's message to indicate that all 55 states have been determined to be substantially equivalent to NASBA's guiding principles of enforcement. Clarification was added regarding the elimination of Phase 2. We updated the activities and accomplishments section to include information determinations made in the July MSG meeting. And in the conclusion section, for consistency's sake, we removed the term mobility and replaced it with practice privilege. In addition, Mr. Chairman, the statistics have been updated in the report and are current through July 1, 2017. Mr. Chairman, staff recommend that the MSG approve this report and delegate authority to the executive officer to make any necessary updates and statistics to the report later on this year. Thus concludes my remarks.
Thank you, and just as a reminder for the committee, I mean, obviously a lot of great work from staff that started very timely, really to facilitate the legislative report process as well, and so it made sense to go simultaneous. That's why you're seeing this before the calendar year closes. But any questions, thoughts on the report?
Appreciation, again.
lots of appreciation. Somebody comfortable making a motion on approving the form of report, subject to any final modifications that the executive officer can oversee?
So moved.
Second. First and second. Any further discussion? Input from the public? Call for the vote.
Dominic Franzella,
Yes.
Don Driftmeyer,
Yes?
Joe Petito,
Yes.
Jose Campos.
Yes.
Carrie Ann Farrell Hines.
Yes.
And Stuart Wellman.
Yes.
With that, motion carries. Good work. Thank you very much to the team for some tremendous effort on getting both of those reports to a great place. Item 7 is public comments. Seeing none. Agenda items for next meeting. Other than continuing discussion, we can decide, whether what the timing of the next meeting might be. Not sure that we would need one in November, but we can certainly discuss that subsequently. But obviously that one item remained. Any other topics? Okay, hearing none. With that, we're adjourned. Thank you.